The name's Spicer, the Spicer, and welcome to the Gunpla Network. Now that everyone has had plenty of time to watch Hathaway's Flash and the litany of reviews and opinion videos that have followed, I thought it'd be fun to do something a little different in talking about the most unique Gundam film we've seen. Today we'll be examining a few characters through the lens of the James Bond film franchise. If you're not familiar with James Bond 007, allow me just a moment to get you up to speed. James Bond originally appeared in Ian Fleming's novels and short stories starting back in the 1950s. Bond is one of MI6's 00 agents, being the best of the best, the elite if you will, and having a license to kill. 007 would make his debut on the big screen in 1962, with Dr. No being played by one Sean Connery. 24 films and 5 actors later, the Bond film franchise is one of the highest grossing of all time. Hathaway's Flash is unique in the world of Gundam, as its mythos is significantly different and actually much closer to that of a James Bond film. Not only is it more of a spy thriller, but we also see the essential archetypal characters. We have the Bond girl, the heavy henchman, the mastermind, and of course James Bond himself. Have you ever lost a part to the void? Did something break? Did your pet ever eat part of a runner? Are you looking for really specific parts for custom work? Well, Mecha Parts Guy is here to help. Mecha Parts Guy is an online retailer that specializes in selling Gunpla, Evangelion, Kotobukiya, and Flame Toys kits, as well as many other types of model kits. If anything is Plamo, they've probably got it. No need to buy the whole new kit, just buy the specific pieces you're missing and keep on building. As a member of the Gunpla Network community, you are also entitled to a permanent 10% off discount at the store when you use the promo code Gunpla Network 10. First, we start with the iconic Bond girl in Gigi Andalucia. Now, the Bond film franchise has had a long, problematic history with its representation of its female characters, but there are still a few that did get a pretty good treatment in the script and are treated well throughout the film. While not everyone's Team Gigi, it's undeniable that she's central to Hathaway's development throughout the film. She is the universe challenging him to leave the identity of Hathaway Noah behind and truly embrace being Mofty Navu Aaron. Sure, she's not a super spy, but she seems incredibly perceptive, matching not only Hathaway but Kenneth beat for beat in almost every single one of their conversations. Oddly enough, in terms of Gundam, she actually has kind of a Lacus Clyne vibe to her. Staying out of Gundam, though, one of the first really solid parallels we'd see in the Bond franchise would be Tracy Draco, or Tracy Bond, from 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The first and only time George Lazenby would don the license to kill, his version of Bond is paired with what would turn out to be his equal in Diana Rigg's Tracy Draco. Now, the name Diana Rigg may sound pretty familiar, as she played Orlana Tyrell from Game of Thrones. Sadly, she passed in 2020, but her memory lives on in her on-screen roles. I originally referred to her as Tracy Bond, as she's the only Bond girl to actually get married to James Bond on screen. Tracy may start out as a damsel in distress, but we quickly find out that she's capable of handling herself 100% in most any situation. Not only does Tracy actually handle herself, she actually rescues Bond at his lowest point in the film. She's just as witty and cunning as Bond, and oddly enough, is just about as good in a fight. Tracy, much like Gigi, is a challenge from the universe for Bond to move past himself, or in this instance, move past Blofeld, his arch-nemesis. In more recent memory, Vesper from 2006's Casino Royale, played by Eva Green, is also a great example of a challenged Bond. Much like Gigi, Vesper tries to push Bond to stop being James Bond to become 007. This is actually a pretty unique portrayal of Bond, as he's actually the only freshly minted 00 agent we see in the entire franchise. Unlike Hathaway, Daniel Craig's Bond is consumed by James Bond's ego instead of his duty as 007 to Queen and Country. He would always put his immediate desires before his mission, and M would constantly criticize him as being just a blunt object. Vesper is the only character outside of M to pretty much confront him the same way. In fact, we actually have really good matching scenes to compare against. The airport scene matches up to Casino Royale's train scene where we first meet Vesper. The hotel scenes match up pretty well, actually. The nighttime mobile suit fight matches Bond's brutal fight in the stairway, and lastly, the scene where Hathaway leaves without saying goodbye to Gigi mirrors Bond's phrasing at the end of Casino Royale. Much like Lazenby before him, Daniel Craig's Bond actually decides to retire at the very end of his movie before, well, I guess the last big action scene happens. Every other Bond is usually pretty consistent in the fact that they'll be staying as James Bond. The whole scene where Kenneth confronts Hathaway about leaving without saying goodbye to Gigi is always kind of played as a romantic type conversation in my head. The multiple times I've watched it always kind of comes off the same way. But Hathaway seems to be more referring to the fact that he's choosing Mofty Navu Aaron over Hathaway Noah. He's choosing this dangerous, radical life over his fairly comfortable life as a botanist. The next character is less impactful, but I think more interesting than most people give him credit for. I'm talking about the role of the heavy henchman in Lane Aim and the Penelope. Yes, the Penelope is part of this, as Lane Aim's not actually a physical threat to Hathaway at all in the film. But the Penelope absolutely is, however it needs Lane Aim to pilot it. Well, the Penelope is the physical block. It is cool that Lane is also kind of a foil for Hathaway. He's a mirror image, if you will, of the younger Hathaway. Hathaway even says he has a good look on his face, reminds me of when I was younger. We don't see a lot of interaction between Hathaway and Lane, but the few little bits we do get are incredibly important. Since the film doesn't have a lot of hand-to-hand combat and really doesn't have a lot of mobile suit combat either, the Heavy's job in this instance is to impede the protagonist as much as possible. So of course the Penelope is physically inhibiting Hathaway from doing what he needs to, but it also makes Hathaway kind of question himself a little, seeing the naivete that Lane provides, kind of reflecting the younger version of Hathaway back at him. We don't necessarily have a great comparison in the world of Bond, as the more famous heavies like Jaws and Oddjob are really just more fan favorites than they actually are foils to Bond in most ways. But if we look at someone like From Russia with Love's Red Grant, or The Man with the Golden Gun's Francisco Scaramanga, we see someone who's a lot closer to Bond. Red Grant isn't your regular henchman, he's specifically trained to just kill James Bond. And that way he is the dark side of James Bond, reflecting the cold, calculated assassin that Bond has to be sometimes. Red is much more of a traditional heavy with very few speaking lines, but Francisco Scaramanga is a little bit more fleshed out. Scaramanga is not only the heavy of his movie, but also the mastermind. He sees Bond as his contemporary and respects him as a fellow assassin. This rubs Bond the wrong way, as played by Roger Moore at least, and he sees himself more of doing a duty instead of doing a job. Well, Roger Moore nor Sean Connery were incredibly physical takes on Bond like Daniel Craig. Both had their darker moments. It's these reflections from Scaramanga, or even to an extent Red Grant, that we kind of see in a way from Lane Aim, reminding Hathaway of how he was during Char's counterattack, which led to the entire point of this film. It reinforces the memories that he has of Quest and really makes him question this whole resolve that he just tested getting into the Cassis. Someone that else is kind of similar is Alex Trevelyan 006 from Pierce Brosnan's GoldenEye. 006 is actually a pretty good mix of the heavy as well as the mastermind. He does both, and as I said, he's a 006, so he's a 00 agent, much like James Bond. They even have a camaraderie at the very beginning of the movie between 006 and 007. This actually makes Kenneth an incredibly great representation for 006 in the Gundam world. Sure, Kenneth never physically fights Gundam, but he equals him at almost every turn in every scene they're in. The mental chess we get to see in every interaction makes up every action scene in this film almost. It's not rare that Bond really meets the antagonist before their final confrontation, and really, this is kind of the most we would get, I would say. There may be a few instances in the Bond film franchise where you have multiple interactions kind of sprinkled throughout the film, but I would say Kenneth and Hathaway share a lot more screen time. Alex Trevelyan, 006, is just as cunning and matches Bond step for step in their interactions, almost having a very kind of laid-back, jovial vibe between the two, which is why I think 006 makes more of a direct comparison for Kenneth than someone like Scaramanga. Scaramanga respects Bond, but Bond doesn't respect him and is usually dismissive and condescending. Hathaway and Kenneth share a kind of mutual respect that 006 and 007 would naturally have. Now, if we're really looking at another mastermind, we of course can't go without mentioning any of the versions of Blofeld, as pretty much every film it's played by a different person. There are a lot of varieties, but generally speaking, they are just as witty as Bond, and when they meet him, pretty much all discretion goes out the window. Bond knows that they're the villain, or at least somewhat suspect, and Bond usually goes out of his way to make sure that they know he's not above board. They know something's going on with him. And a really interesting play on this is actually Timothy Dalton's Bond in License to Kill. He plays it off that he's kind of been kicked out of MI6 towards the latter portion of the movie, and luckily events would happen to work out the way that his main antagonist is like, oh yeah, I totally buy that. You're ex-MI6, you're 00 agent that's been burned, absolutely come work for me. That's a great idea. So it works out for him very well, which actually leads me to the last person I'd like to talk about in James Bond, or Hathaway Noah themselves. Timothy Dalton's Bond is absolutely burned by MI6 in License to Kill. He goes off on his own, he goes AWOL, and MI6 for the most part is not helping him. Sure, Q kind of comes out to help him at a certain point in the movie, but we kind of get the vibe that that's not an official MI6 sanctioned thing. This also kind of happens with Daniel Craig a lot. Every movie he kind of starts in the same place of being this blunt instrument, and am kind of harassing him throughout the films for this. But generally speaking, it's these depictions, the kind of harsher, more brooding depictions of Bond, that show us the duality of James Bond in 007. There's a constant fight between the person and the role. We don't see it necessarily directly depicted as much with Timothy Dalton, but with him going out on his own and making more of a decision based on James Bond's feelings versus 007's duty, it does show us that this character has his own motivations regardless of what the British government thinks. We see this happen in Quantum of Solace with Daniel Craig's James Bond, where they they come in to detain him and take him back to England, but Captain America's his way out of an elevator and then goes back on his adventure, with the only person trusting him being M. Now, if we really fast forward our way back, we see something similar from George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. At the end, he is ready to retire, and once the kind of big final action scene happens, he goes right back into wanting to catch Blofeld. He goes back in on, oh, this is the James Bond I am, and it just happens to turn out that the one thing that had distracted him is now gone. It is like a 40-ish year old movie, so I guess spoilers, but Tracy gets got. She gets shot, And in that moment, well, James Bond doesn't know it. He said, "Oh, that's Blofeld, we have to go after them," only to realize that she had been shot and is dead. This is probably one of the most emotionally intense scenes in James Bond in general, as one of the few times someone that's very dear to James Bond actually dies in front of him. You see something similar in Skyfall as well with James Bond and M. How does this relate to Hathaway, though? Well, that's the entire central conflict for Hathaway. He is trying to figure out whether he's going to preserve the identity of Hathaway Noah or abandon it to become Mofty Navu Aaron. Well, it's less about wanting to make sure he can come back to that role. It's more just about letting go of the past. Sure, his initial motivations may have been linked to quests and what happened in Char's counterattack, but he can't let go of that until very late in the movie with a lot of coercing by Gigi. When he has his final kind of test of his courage, if you will, or his belief when he's getting into the Cassis, he specifically mentions quests and how he's kind of moving past it, or at least accepting it. This is the same duality. Does he do what he wants, which would be to stay as Hathaway Noah, or at least maintain it, or does he follow his duty to the entire movement he's helped create and walk into the shoes of Mofty Navu Aaron, become the leader that this organization desperately needs? This is something that really legitimized a lot of the events of Char's counterattack, as Neo Zeon was able to rally around Char as the main leader of the organization, and why Full Frontal still has such power by the time you get to Unicorn versus the actual legitimate heir in Maneva Zabi. If Mofty never had a solid leader and was kind of a shadow organization, it would be much less likely to actually achieve its goal of clearing out the cabinet ministers of the Federation and moving everyone into space. So by the end of the movie, letting all pretense fall to the wayside and pretty much allowing, or kind of happening, that Kenneth stumbles upon the fact that Hathaway is Mofty Navu Aaron, as well as Lane Aim, abandoning this entire history that he has built to forge a new path that hopefully would save humanity. All in all, these characters being in this film in the way that they are makes this significantly different. As I mentioned, this is a very light combat film. There's not a lot going on in it in terms of action, which is very different than, say, something like F91 or even Char's counterattack. This is a much slower paced film that's more about the actions of the individuals than it is these big space battles. And the fact that we barely get into space is actually really refreshing. Sure, that's kind of been a death sentence for several Gundam series, but it is cool to see Gundam take on this new realm, and it makes me hope that we'll get to see more stuff like this. Now, of course, Hathaway's Flash is a novel series, so we'll have to see, but it would be nice for Gundam to dabble in things like this with spy thrillers, or just something that's not these war dramas or space operas, if you will. But those are just my thoughts, kind of viewing it from the lens of my knowledge of the James Bond film franchise. Of course, if I missed any connections, do let me know in the comments below, and if you'd like to see more random videos like this, we would be more than happy to provide them. As always, friends, I've been the Spicer here for the Gunpla Network. Please stay safe and keep on building.